You know, when I looked at this list, there's so many businesses on there, and I thought, which one is the most important? Which one should you talk about? And being, I'm going to hold you at it, I've got 15 minutes, I wouldn't have time to go through all of them. So I thought, it's hard to say which one is the most important. But I have to say that I finally decided that probably the most important was the Climax Molybdenum. And the reason I thought of that is because all these mines, they were great. They're responsible for all of these buildings we got on Harrison Avenue. There was all these people living here at that time, maybe 30 to 40,000 people. And you needed all of the commercial for these people. And they brought in a lot of money. But the mainstay, as far as economics, is Climax. They started much after all this did, but they provided a living for many, many people for 64 years going. So that's when I thought I'd start out with today. And Tara, don't correct me if I'm wrong.
I am in no position to ever correct you.
She's from Climax, as everybody knows. So anyway, I have this prepared for a library talk, and so this is going to be kind of a practice. And it's good for me, and I hope it's good for you. But it's titled "The Birth, the Death, and the Resurrection of the Climax Mine." And we go back to the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, when everybody came up to Central City, and then eventually got up to Leadville, and that's where the major gold strikes occurred. And during those days, when the gold miners, they were annoyed by the dark sands that were plugging their sluice boxes. And so they didn't know what it was. And they were actually hauling it and using it on some of the roads, putting it down. Well, it turned out it was silver. And it was very, and silver then in the 1860s became the main thing. The gold was pretty well worked out, and so they went to silver. So in 1879, which is also the year my great-grandfather came to Leadville, he came as a prospector. In 1879, Leadville had a population of at least 30,000 people. It was the biggest town between St. Louis and San Francisco. There was a fellow named Charles Center, ended up coming to Leadville. Charles Center was born in 1846. He fought in the Civil War. He was an Indian fighter, and he became a prospector also. He came to Leadville as a mule skinner on Mosquito Range. And from there, there's so many people in Leadville at that time. Center didn't really like what was going on in Leadville. He didn't like the casinos, the brothels, all the wildlife, and he wasn't making a living anyway. So he decided to go further north, and he went up into the present area of Climax. Actually, he found Bartlett Mountain, and he knew there was something up there, but he didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what it was. And so he kept his claim on there, but however, it took him 14 years to really file that claim because nobody else was interested in it. Then in 1890, there's several prospectors from Denver who had those gray rocks from Bartlett Mountain sampled, and these claims were next to centers, and they thought it was galena, which is often found in silver. So they thought they had another silver mine. But then the assay proved erroneous. Well, Center then sent samples to the Colorado School of Mines, and they are the ones who called it graphite. And a lot of people forever thought it was graphite. And that proved incorrect. So finally, there was an assayer from the east who called it molybdenum. And soon, many prospectors were finding claims on Bartlett. Some of the most notable were Hugh Leal, And it was the Colorado Springs investors who called their organization the Colorado Molybdenum Company. And also Otis Archie Keene. And I don't know how many's ever heard of Otis Archie Keene. He was a pretty remarkable man. I had the opportunity of meeting him when I was early in my career at Climax. He's only about this tall, a very short guy. But anyway, he was he had a claim up there also. And you'll hear more about him eventually. But then in 1912, a mill in Kvina, Norway, learned to separate the molybdenum from the rocks through the process called flotation. I think everybody knows what flotation is, right? You don't have to explain that? Yeah. Where was I here? Yeah, okay, so he was selling the moly to a German foundry. It's called the Krupp Armament Works, and they were using the moly to harden steel. It's one of its main uses even today. Well, Center offered to sell them his molybdenum. They turned him down because they had enough that they were getting out of Norway. And getting back to Otis Archie Keene, he leased an abandoned mill in Leadville, and he hauled this molybdenum rock down to Leadville from Climax, a distance of 13 to 15 miles, with a 20-mule team, which is be neat to see that today. But anyway, he hauled all that molybdenum down there, and they actually learned to float it here in Leadville. And that mill, the ruins of that mill is still visible if you go down towards Streamtown. It's on the north side, just before Streamtown. If you're headed west, it's on the hillside. You see all those concrete foundations. That was the mill that he was using. So actually, got to start in Leadville. So, and there still wasn't a major market. So Keene let his options go on the Leal to a guy named Ed Heckendorf. He already had other claims. And Heckendorf in 1916 met with a fellow who became very big in Climax. His name was Max Schott. And he was working for a company called American Metals that actually originated in Germany. And keep in mind now, this is around the time of the First World War. And he was trying to convince Schott that the claims on Bartlett were solid and there was a lot of high grade present. Well, finally, in 1917, American Metals formed a subsidiary called the Climax Syndicate, and they took over 25 acres of the Leal claims. By this time, the United States was involved in the war. And then keep in mind that the Schott was from Germany, and he was part of the German contingent. They called themselves American Metals, so that their people wouldn't confiscate whatever work they were doing in the United States. However, fortunately, none of the molybdenum went to Germany. And then in 1918, American Metals renamed Climax Syndicate the Climax Molybdenum Company, as it has existed to this day. In February of 1918, the Climax built a mill and started feeding their new 250-ton mill with an aerial tram. The aerial tram came from way up high on the mountain. There was Leal, I forgot the name of the other claim. Do you remember the other? White. The Leal and the White levels. And they were mining up there, and they ran the tram clear down to almost where the highway is now. And they had one little ball mill. If you realize the size of a ball mill, 250 ton per day is the size of that mill that we have out on the Dutch Henry for the bike trail. You've all seen that. That's about 250. Today, you guys are running, how many ton? How big is that mill?
Really big.
Well, I think,
Right there, though.
I think most of you saw it when they're hauling pieces of it through town.
30,000.
It's 30,000 ton a day. Yeah, that's right. Well, I didn't want to say that because I wasn't quite sure. I knew you wouldn't.
Don't.
And after this, The major mill expansions were larger ball mills, and finally these little mills got moved to the high-grade circuit, and the high-grade made the purest moly in the world. It was, back in the days I was there, Irish soap was advertised to be at 99.9%, and we strived to make the moly 99.9, and we did. We had a good high-grade circuit. Then after World War I, the sales of moly went to zero, and the value of moly was $1 a pound. That's about where you're getting now.
Pretty close.
And the Climax Mine shut down in March of 1919. And then a guy come along named Brainerd Phillipson. He became the president in 1919. And he worked hard trying to find markets for molybdenum. In fact, his best luck was with an automobile company called Wills St. Clair. And they were the first to use molybdenum as hardened steel in that automobile. And that automobile is the same automobile as in the mining museum. If you haven't looked at it, you ought to go up and take a look. It's in the Climax room. So anyway, other people saw that there was a use for this molybdenum. So in 1924, it started selling better, and they reopened. And in that year, they made 170 tons a day. Like she said, they're like 30,000 tons a day now. And when I was up there, we had a lot of mills. We had 21 ball mills, but they're smaller. And we made 58,000 tons a day was our record. Anyway, in their final years, they were averaging 48,000 tons per day. And their maximum employment at one time was 3,080 people in 1979. And now you're at what, about 400? So that's a lot of difference. A lot of difference. The annual payroll was over 67 million back then. And you know, molybdenum was also found as a byproduct in copper. But in years back, it wasn't worth processing because the price was so low, it went to the tailings. But when Climax kept raising their dollar per pound, these copper mines saw it was worthwhile, so they put in a circuit, and eventually Climax had to lower their value, and things kept getting worse, and it caused some of the major buyers of Climax to cancel orders and go to other people who were selling cheaper molybdenum. So in 1982 and then in 1987, Climax had major layoffs. Production continued until 1992 when it finally shut down. And in 74 years, this is what's important to this whole thing. In 74 years, Climax mined 470 million tons of ore. They produced 1.9 billion pounds of molybdenum and hired over 60,000 people. In 2013, Freeport McMoran invested over $750 million in the resurrection of the Climax property. It is running, and now Bartlett is providing molybdenum once again. That's most of that story, but one thing I want to add to the Climax thing is back in those days, I think it was 1917, Summit County had Mount Bartlett. The county line was right at the top of Fremont Pass. It follows the Continental Divide. Well, there was also a small deposit of molybdenum down at Chalk's Bluff. Everybody knows what Chalk Bluff is. It's about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile south of Climax. And so Summit County said, well, this mountain molybdenum is good stuff. Let's go ahead and get this stuff down at Chalk Mountain too. And the way we'll get it is we'll move the county line a mile and a half down the road. And so they were going to do it. And so the county commissioners in Leadville said, you know, that's not a good idea. Why don't we sue to move the county line 2 miles the other way? which would take Martland into Lake County, and Summit County eventually got all the tailings, and we got the moly. But you know, as politics go, and still to this day, the people in towns uproar. Why do we want to spend $5,000 on these attorneys to take over a mountain that has a metal that we can't even pronounce, and we're not even sure if it's any good? So I think that someday somebody ought to put a statue up for those 3 county commissioners for that 74 years of moly that came to Leadville. That's all I got.
Thank you.